Read through a psychologist's eyes, this story is about the exact second a woman stops begging for care and starts seeing the truth. She is in labor, frightened, exhausted, and still forced to witness the man she trusted prioritize another woman's comfort over her pain. But humiliation has a threshold. Once crossed, it does something irreversible. What begins as heartbreak in a hospital room becomes the birth of a colder, clearer, more dangerous kind of self respect.
She was in a gilded suite at a private Manhattan birthing center, bringing their first child into the world completely alone. Another contraction seized her, and she tracked its peak on the monitor, breathing through the pain. On the phone, her husband Marcus had been so convincing, swearing he was locked in a boardroom with investors, finalizing a funding round that would change their lives. He wasn't in a boardroom. He was at a rooftop lounge in Soho, handing a coupe of champagne to another woman, a brilliant product manager he'd mentored, whose recent promotion apparently required a toast against the glittering city lights and the full attention of a man who just ignored his laboring wife's third call. And when her name flashed across his screen again, he shot a look at the woman beside him and let it go to voicemail. He offered no comfort, just a single text that shattered her reality. Chloe just made VP, celebrating the win. He was feting his star employee's success while his wife endured labor pains by herself, leaving her to bring their son into the world alone while he played the role of the proud boss. All the while, the soft chimes of the maternity ward echoed outside her door, and his own mother sent him a congratulatory text, having seen a photo from the party online, praising how dedicated he was to his work. But none of them knew the whole story. Not the charismatic executive, not his ambitious protege, not his adoring mother. The woman they were all forgetting, the one breathing through the agony in that silent room, said absolutely nothing. She was the anonymous creator of Ether, the revolutionary data analytics platform that was the entire basis for his tech company's valuation. She was a phantom in the world of Silicon Alley, a ghost billionaire, and she was about to make a single calm call to her legal counsel that would activate a termination clause, vaporizing the very core of his existence, the company, the penthouse apartment, and the lie of the self-made man he thought he was. What she set in motion left him so completely broken, both financially and personally, he couldn't form a sentence. And the resulting intellectual property audit of his mistress's work exposed a systemic theft that unwound every lie he had ever constructed. This story proves a fundamental truth. Never mistake quiet composure for a lack of power. Never assume a private individual is a weak one, and never, ever mistake someone's moment of vulnerability for your opportunity for betrayal. You have absolutely no idea what kind of force you are provoking, and by the time you find out, it will be the most devastating lesson of your life. If this message resonates with you, type the word power in the comments below. Click the like button so this story can reach someone else who needs this message. Share it with a friend who has been underestimated, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a reminder of your own inner strength. Stay with us until the very end, because the most crucial moment is still coming. For every person who has ever been sidelined, betrayed, or diminished by someone they trusted, this story is for you. Today, you will witness precisely why the most unassuming person in the room is often the one in complete control, why treachery has a strange way of ricocheting back to the sender, and why maintaining your grace in silence is the most powerful response to being wronged. Pay attention to every detail, because a critical lesson is embedded in each one. Tell us in the comments what you took from this and what you might have done differently. Subscribe for more stories that will empower you. No one at the prestigious Hudson Palisades Birthing Pavilion in New York City had any idea, not the chief of staff, not the hospital's board of directors, not even the CIO who oversaw their vast data infrastructure, that the woman in maternity suite 10, breathing calmly through her contractions, was the anonymous architect of the software platform that optimized their hospital's entire endowment fund. She was an invisible hand guiding their own financial future, a name buried under layers of shell corporations, and she was completely oblivious of how her obsession with staying anonymous was about to become the most devastating weapon in her arsenal. Not through some grand complex plan, but because life has a terrifyingly precise sense of irony. A venture capital firm her private fund had invested in had been an early backer of his tech startup 3 years ago, a minor entry in a sprawling portfolio. She'd never met the founders, never knew the company's name, and had no idea this was the hospital where her son would choose to be born. She also had no idea it was happening on the same night. That her husband of 5 years, the man for whom she had secretly built an entire sandbox to play in, was with his mistress celebrating a stolen success in a penthouse whose company lease was, technically, underwritten by her capital. His star protege was having her big moment, and he was toasting her in the heart of Manhattan. The same city, the same web of influence, the same moment in time. It was as if every element of his betrayal had been scripted by a cruel and clever playwright. What happens when the most powerful, invisible woman in New York gets treated like a fool? What did she do that left him utterly destroyed? When the staggering truth of her identity was finally laid bare before him, was there anything left of his life to even try to save? Viewers, what you've just experienced is only the introduction. The real story, the affair that was concealed for months, the corporate fraud that went far deeper than a single promotion, and the final quiet act that completely dismantles a man who believed he was untouchable, is about to unfold. This story will do more than hold your attention. It will show you what true power looks like when it's been pushed to its breaking point. Stay with us until the final word, because that is where the most profound lesson is waiting. Post your thoughts in the comments right now and subscribe for more stories that will stick with you. The contractions were now hitting every 4 minutes, but Olivia Caldwell was no longer timing them with anxiety. She was logging them with the cold, detached precision of a woman who had long ago deemed panic an inefficient waste of resources. She was in a suite at the Hudson Palisades Medical Center, the city's testament to modern healthcare, a tower of glass and chrome with whisper-quiet halls and the kind of flawless service that was funded by enormous donations from the tech sector. She rested her forehead against the cool glass of the window, her body perfectly still as she concentrated on weathering the pain by herself. Her baby bag sat untouched on a chair. She had packed it herself a month earlier, folding every tiny garment with the private delight of a woman who had yearned for this child for years. A small, hand-knit green cap, a worn-out copy of a seminal book on machine learning from her mentor, and a small, framed photo of her very first server, the humming machine in a tiny apartment that became the seed of her empire. Her first investor told her once, across a table littered with schematics, the only asset that can never be stripped from you is the one you build inside your own mind. Olivia hadn't fully understood the weight of that advice until her platform's first valuation came in, but tonight she wasn't thinking about market disruptions or user data or the staggering fortune tied to her identity. She was thinking about how her husband, Marcus, had now ignored 2 of her calls. She was thinking about the polite, yet pitying tone the night nurse had used with her. She was thinking about how immense the silence in the suite felt, and how, more than anything else, she just wanted to hold his hand. But his hand was not there. She had first called Marcus at 8:15 p.m. The pain had been manageable then, and her voice had been steady and calm. He picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice wrapped in that polished, artificial charisma she recognized as his boardroom voice, the one he used for everyone but her. "I'm on my way," he'd assured her. "We're just dotting the I's on the Series C funding. Get settled in, babe. I'll be there before you even have a chance to miss me." She had believed him because for 5 years, believing him had been a conscious decision. And because the alternative, a dense knot of suspicion that had been tightening in her stomach for the past year, was a reality she was not ready to face while trying to bring their son into the world. Here is a vital piece of wisdom, viewers. A person's real character is exposed by how they behave when you are at your most vulnerable. Never forget that. It will save you. But Marcus was not dotting I's on a contract. At that exact moment, while Olivia was being escorted to her maternity suite on the 10th floor, Marcus Vance was ordering 2 glasses of Prosecco at the Apex, a rooftop lounge with a stunning view of the skyline. He moved with the unearned confidence of a man who believed he was the sole architect of his own success, passing one of the glasses to a woman named Chloe. Chloe was not an investor, she was a product manager, and she was celebrating. She put a hand to her chest in a perfectly practiced gesture of humility, her designer dress impeccable, her laughter echoing with the sound of triumph. Every one of her movements was an act in a carefully staged play about ambition, and Marcus was her captivated audience. He led her to a corner table with his hand placed possessively on the small of her back, his face illuminated with a type of pride Olivia hadn't seen directed at her in the 9 exhausting months of her pregnancy. Back in the sterile calm of the hospital room, a large flat-screen television was mounted on the wall, the volume muted on a local business news channel. He had not said a word about a celebration. He had, Olivia was slowly beginning to realize with a sickening lurch, been very clear about working through the night at the office. Her suite was luxurious, with a panoramic window that framed the entire Manhattan skyline. The nurse had called it their most exclusive room. Olivia had just settled into bed, trying to breathe evenly through the intensifying waves of pain. Amelia was smoothing the silk of her evening gown over her belly, her phone in hand, about to try calling Julian for the 3rd time, when the sound system hissed to life. A hot mic from backstage. He was supposed to be coordinating with the senator's team. Another deep, cramping pain seized her, a tidal wave that stole her breath and made her grip the edge of the table. As the pain receded and her focus returned, she heard her husband's voice echoing through the grand ballroom, low and intimate. He was talking to Sophia, his press secretary. "Just a few more weeks," Julian was saying. "After the baby comes, she'll be too distracted to notice when we start the transition. You'll be the one by my side in Washington, I promise." From the other side of the table, his mother Eleanor seemed to glide into view. She'd been holding court with a donor, and Amelia hadn't seen her approach. Eleanor adjusted the diamond brooch on her lapel, her face a perfect portrait of controlled fury. The look she shot her son, who was just now emerging from backstage, was a silent, venomous command. Julian rushed to Amelia's side. He didn't ask if she was all right. There was no flicker of guilt, no stammered denial, none of the basic humanity the moment called for. He looked down at her the way a strategist assesses a sudden political liability, a crisis to be contained, immediately and without sentiment. His voice was a harsh, urgent whisper, intended for Amelia but loud enough for his mother to hear. "Sophia is having a full-blown panic attack. The campaign's top donor heard everything. She's hyperventilating. She needs a quiet place. You can go to the manager's office." Amelia stared, the air stolen from her lungs. Another contraction was starting, a sharp, twisting knot deep in her abdomen. In the momentary quiet before it peaked, she looked at the man she'd built a life with, the father of the child now fighting its way into the world, and understood with a sudden, chilling certainty that her entire marriage had just been a stepping stone in his career. She didn't move fast enough for him. Julian took her by the elbow, his grip surprisingly firm, and began steering her through the crowd. He was guiding her away, creating an open path for his mother to escort a theatrically weeping Sophia in the opposite direction. The gesture was both flagrantly public and brutally personal, a clear message to the 100-plus onlookers. He had just pushed his wife, in the middle of labor, out of the spotlight to manage the emotional breakdown of his mistress. At a nearby table, the city's most feared food critic, a woman named Genevieve Croft, put down her fork. At 53, with 2 decades of culinary commentary under her belt, Genevieve sat perfectly still behind her wineglass, watching the drama unfold with the detached focus of a hawk spotting its prey. She knew that getting involved was not her place. She lifted her glass of Barolo, took a long, measured sip, the only gesture of solidarity she could offer. Across the ballroom, another chef stopped mid-sentence, his fork hovering over his plate. The glittering chandeliers suddenly felt like interrogation lamps, burning this quiet act of betrayal into everyone's memory. And Eleanor, watching her daughter-in-law falter as a contraction made her lean against a pillar, watching her body tense with a soft gasp of pain that no woman should have to endure in a room full of strangers, lifted a perfectly manicured hand to her mouth. It was not to cover a gasp of shock. It was to hide a smirk. A tiny, triumphant curl of her lips, a glimmer of victory that was made infinitely more grotesque by its cold public satisfaction. The silent, smug dismissal hit Amelia harder than the most vicious insult. When people reveal their true nature in a crisis, my friends, when they find a private victory in your suffering or treat your greatest moment of need as a public relations problem, you must believe them, not tomorrow, right then. For 6 years, Eleanor had demonstrated her disapproval of Amelia through 1,000 polite cuts perfected by the Boston elite. Like at the library fundraiser, when she gestured to Amelia's award-winning restaurant and remarked with a chilly smile, "It's a lovely little hobby. Julian has always been so supportive of a woman's passions." Or the meticulously curated photographs on the mantle of their Beacon Hill brownstone, where Amelia was always pictured at a charity event or a garden party, never in her chef's whites, a decorative spouse in the story of her husband's ambition. The way Eleanor would sing Sophia's praises at political functions long before Amelia knew her as the other woman. Such a brilliant political mind. She truly understands the sacrifices required to build a legacy like the one Julian is destined for. It was the unmistakable sound of a matriarch who had already selected her son's next wife and was just waiting for the first one's contract to expire. Amelia had never challenged her, not out of fear, but from a principle learned in the brutal heat of a Michelin-starred kitchen. The best way to handle an opponent who underestimates you is to let them think they have you cornered, right up until the moment you reveal you control the entire supply chain. 3 seconds after Eleanor smirked, Amelia decided that moment had come. As the pain faded, Amelia gently pulled her arm from Julian's grasp. She ignored him, turned, and met Eleanor's gaze across the room. Her own eyes, moments ago clouded with pain, were now sharp and clear as glass. She walked to a quiet alcove, pulled out her phone, and tapped a contact saved not as a name, but simply as Dubois. She hit the call button. The line connected before the first ring was finished, and a man's calm baritone voice answered. It was the voice of a man who had built a restaurant empire from a single bistro in the North End. His name was Auguste Dubois. He was 71 years old, and for the past 40 of them, he had served as the undisputed king of Boston's culinary scene, a mentor and patron, whose word could create a legend or end a career. Amelia spoke only 4 words. "Augusta, I'm at the Fairmont." A brief silence followed, not of confusion, but of a brilliant mind instantly calculating the ingredients of a disaster he was about to turn into a masterpiece. Then Auguste replied, his tone as steady as if she were calling to report the night's final covers. "I understand. Do not leave. I will handle it." In his study overlooking the public garden, Auguste hung up the phone. His young protege, a rising star chef, looked up from the menu they were reviewing. Auguste was already putting on his tweed jacket. "A change of plans," Auguste said, picking up his phone again to dial a new number. The protege looked confused. Monsieur, it is almost 11. What is so urgent? Auguste paused with the phone to his ear and said one word: justice. Amelia ended the call and tucked the phone back into her clutch. She walked to an empty table by the window and sat down, possessing the unsettling calm of a person who has just dropped a match into a pool of gasoline and is now simply waiting for the inevitable roar. Julian was completely oblivious. He was now guiding a still sniffling Sophia toward the exit, his hand on the small of her back, whispering assurances into her ear. It was as if he had entirely forgotten, or simply decided it was no longer relevant, that his wife was less than 50 feet away, actively going into labor with their first child. Eleanor had resumed her position in the corner, holding her phone. She was dictating a text message with cold precision, no doubt to a crisis manager, spinning the narrative before the first blogger could even post. Her eyes met Amelia's for a fleeting second, and the look she gave was not just disdainful. It was worse. It was a final write-off. 10 minutes. Amelia breathed through the next contraction alone, one hand pressed against the cool pane of the window, her eyes fixed on the string of lights along the Charles River. She was patient. The atmosphere in the ballroom changed at precisely 9 minutes and 30 seconds after her call. It started not with a sound, but with a synchronized series of flashes from a dozen phones. A ripple of murmurs turned into a wave of gasps. It was the sound of a story breaking, of a narrative being seized and rewritten in real time. The sharp, distinct buzz of a breaking news alert, followed by the urgent murmur of a headline being read aloud. The sound of Julian's own phone vibrating with an authority that no personal call possesses. Then the story appeared on every screen. Julian's face went white. It was from the Boston Chronicle, pushed to every subscriber in the city. The headline was stark. Senate hopeful's affair exposed at gala, celebrity chef wife in medical distress. The article was accompanied by a stunning photo of Amelia from a recent magazine cover, juxtaposed against a grainy, long lens shot of Julian whispering intimately to Sophia backstage just moments earlier. The author was Genevieve Croft. Julian looked up from his phone, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Amelia. He took in the scene with a sudden, horrifying clarity. His wife, sitting alone and composed at a table, no longer just his wife, but the hero of a story in which he was the unambiguous villain. His mother, frozen with her phone in her hand, and Genevieve Croft, who raised her wine glass from across the room in a silent final toast. The velvet banquette, just a few tables away, was occupied by a food critic faking a migraine for attention. The man hovering beside her, who was now turning, his expression shifting from feigned sympathy to sharp annoyance at the disturbance. Julian's face, in a single heartbeat, telegraphed every ounce of his indignation before he could even form a word. He then shot a glare at the maitre d', Gerard, the man trapped behind his reservation stand, and spoke in a low, controlled tone that carried the absolute weight of command. Ready the Davenport suite on the penthouse level for Mrs. Croft, and get the premier obstetrics team on standby. Dr. Eleanor Vance is en route to take charge of her care. The restaurant manager, Chloe, moved without hesitation. She didn't ask for clarification. She didn't dare glance at Julian for a countermand. She simply gave a crisp, efficient nod and disappeared toward the kitchens, her pace a study in controlled velocity. Julian, who'd been holding court by the massive, glass-walled wine cellar, turned away from his guests. His hand dropped from a bottle of vintage Bordeaux. A series of emotions washed over his face. First, a flicker of sheer disbelief, then a surge of white-hot anger, and finally the creeping cold dread of a catastrophic miscalculation. Then came the specific rage a chef feels when his authority is challenged on the opening night of his own restaurant. He fell back on the persona that had always served him, the one he used in tense service meetings and on cutthroat cooking shows to dominate the room. He tugged at the cuffs of his bespoke chef's coat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a quiet threat aimed squarely at Arthur. Each syllable was sharp, deliberate, and carried the implicit promise of a brutal firing. "Who in the hell are you, and what gives you the right to give orders to my staff in my establishment?" Arthur looked at Julian Croft with the deep, almost weary patience of a man observing someone who is enthusiastically sawing off the branch they are sitting on. "My name is Arthur Vance," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I am the chief executive of the Davenport Hospitality Group, which, as of 3 years ago, provided the financing for and thus acquired the controlling interest in the Julian Croft brand and all associated ventures." He let that statement settle into the now silent dining room. "Mrs. Amelia Croft," he finished, "is the group's sole heir and director." A heavy, shocked silence fell over the bustling Michelin-starred dining room. A young sommelier near the bar, mid-pour, froze with the bottle hovering over a glass, his mouth slightly agape. He glanced at Chloe, the manager, who had paused her retreat by the service entrance. She calmly picked up a flute of champagne from a passing tray, took a long, deliberate sip, the kind of drink one takes after witnessing a spectacular ego finally get its public reckoning, and savored the moment. Julian's carefully cultivated image of culinary genius didn't just crack. It hung in the air for a moment, a surreal and decaying masterpiece. It was like watching a magnificent ice sculpture. Its hidden support just kicked out, hold its shape for a few impossible seconds before the inevitable shattering collapse. Julian's mother, holding court at a central table, had stopped mid-anecdote. Simone, the food critic, had dropped her act of the inspired, discerning palate, and Amelia, from her corner table, met her husband's gaze for a long, steady moment. She looked at the man who had tucked her away in the corner, who had made his lover's review the centerpiece of the room, who had been her husband for 7 years, and had never once taken the time to see the woman who existed outside the shadow of his own ambition. Then she spoke, her voice soft but clear enough to cut through the stillness. "Arthur, would you please have Miss Dubois' review taken down and removed before the press arrives? It was being showcased as the definitive word on modern cuisine." She rose, smoothing the silk of her midnight blue maternity dress over her belly, and picked up her evening bag. "Julian," she said, moving toward the private elevator, as Arthur and his security team created a seamless shield around her, "your mother just referred to my family's business as some dusty old hotel money." Her voice held no heat, only the cool finality of a fact being carved into stone. "I'd suggest you remind her of that," she added, "because I certainly won't forget it." With that last remark, she left the party, left the corner, left the back table he had relegated her to, and shed the smaller version of herself she had been forced to play for 7 miserable, lonely years. She never once looked back. The burnished bronze elevator doors whispered open to the penthouse, and Amelia stepped into a world so radically different from the loud, glittering performance she'd just left that it felt like crossing into a new reality, separated not just by 20 floors, but by the vast, silent canyon, between the person she had been made to feel she was and the person she had always been. The Davenport family's private penthouse, which crowned their flagship San Francisco hotel, had been designed by the architect behind Kyoto's most tranquil gardens. The floors were dark, polished teak, the lighting was indirect and warm, and the air carried the faint, clean scent of sandalwood from a climate system that had cost more than the restaurant's entire kitchen. On a long, low sideboard sat a single branch of a white magnolia, a spray of flawless blossoms in a simple iron vase, refreshed every morning whether anyone was there to see them or not. Amelia had been paying for that magnolia for her entire life. Dr. Eleanor Vance was already there, waiting by the entrance. At 59, she was the most sought-after perinatologist on the West Coast, a woman who had built a quiet legend delivering the next generation of Silicon Valley fortunes with a calm, decisive authority that money gave you access to, but could never truly buy. She had received Arthur's message less than 10 minutes ago. She was already in the hotel for a charity dinner and had come up with the silent efficiency of a professional who understood that certain calls required her presence, not her questions. She took in Amelia's condition in a single practiced look, the deep exhaustion in her eyes, the protective curve of her shoulders, the small overnight bag she clutched like the last piece of wreckage from a sunken ship. And she made no mention of the drama unfolding downstairs. She simply placed a reassuring hand on Amelia's arm and said, "Welcome. We'll take care of absolutely everything from now on." It was 10 words, but they were the first 10 words spoken to Amelia all evening that were purely for her benefit, with no ulterior motive, no performance, and none of the suffocating weight of someone else's ego. Amelia felt them land in a part of her heart that had been hollow for years. She gave one small, thankful nod and let the doctor lead her deeper into the suite. The main living area was breathtaking, a vast, peaceful space with a single, floor-to-ceiling glass wall that presented the San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate Bridge as a living work of art. The advanced medical monitoring equipment was so seamlessly built into custom walnut cabinetry that the room felt more like a 5-star retreat than a state-of-the-art birthing suite. A beautiful modern bassinet, lined with what appeared to be the softest cashmere imaginable, was placed next to a classic leather armchair. Not a cold visitor's chair, not an afterthought, but a piece selected with the deep understanding that a new mother would need a place of comfort right next to her baby, that she would want to be near her child from the very first breath. Amelia set her bag down on a small table. From inside, she pulled out a small, hand-knitted baby blanket. She placed it where she could see it. Then she took out a silver-framed photograph of her father, Andrew Davenport, the man who had quietly built an empire in hospitality, who lived with profound simplicity despite his immense wealth, who had told her once, leaning over a wide mahogany desk with the special seriousness of a man who knows he has limited time to pass on what truly matters. "The money is the least important part of it, my love. What I'm truly giving you is the tactical advantage of being perpetually underestimated. It's a weapon your rivals can never defend against because they will never even know you have it." Amelia hadn't truly understood what he meant back then. She understood it now. She felt it with the sharp focus that only comes after you've survived the exact crisis that wisdom was meant to prepare you for. 20 floors below, the main dining room had become the venue for a completely different kind of show. Julian Croft hadn't moved for a full 60 seconds. After Amelia had vanished into the elevator, he just stood there in the center of his own grand opening, next to the empty space on the feature wall where his mistress's review had been mounted, in front of the open kitchen where Chloe, the manager, was now meticulously inspecting a single spoon, refusing to meet his eye. The track lighting that had made the framed article look so important now felt like a harsh spotlight in an interrogation room. His wife's family group owned his brand, not as an investor, not as a friendly partner. It owned him. The restaurant he was standing in, the very custom-made pans on his stove, the global culinary empire on which he had built his entire life. It all belonged to Amelia. It had belonged to Amelia for 3 years. For years, he'd managed his affair with the profound arrogance of a man convinced his wife was too absorbed, too sweet-natured, and far too preoccupied with her high society charity balls to ever disrupt his carefully ordered life. The realization didn't slowly sink in. It hit him like a physical blow. It was a complete unraveling of his entire identity. 100 small deceptions he'd brushed aside, suddenly converging into a catastrophic failure, revealing the quiet strength of the woman who had been the true architect of his world all along. He looked over at Genevieve. His mother sat with a rigid, terrifying stillness. Her designer handbag was clutched in her lap, her crimson lipstick applied with surgical precision, But her expression, the one that had observed Clara's quiet devotion with a detached, almost pitying amusement, the one that had subtly angled Clara to the edge of every family portrait, had morphed into something Ethan had never witnessed in his 54 years. Genevieve Hayes, a woman who had never encountered a social dynamic she couldn't control, appeared for the very first time like someone who had just made a final, devastating, and utterly permanent strategic error. "How did you find out?" Ethan's voice was a ragged whisper. It wasn't the anger of an accusation, but the defeated, empty sound of a man watching the life he'd built with such precision detonate before his eyes. Clara Warren said absolutely nothing, her silence a judgment more powerful than any scream. Across town, Maya, who had been celebrating the magazine feature on her latest design project, felt her phone buzz with a frantic text from Ethan. She excused herself from the celebratory dinner, her newfound professional confidence instantly gone. I should take this outside," she stammered to the confused table. "Yes," her mentor, a stern, older designer, said without glancing up from his menu. "I imagine you should." Now, deep in the heart of New Orleans, in the humid, fragrant air of her soon-to-open restaurant's kitchen, Amelia breathed through another wave of Braxton Hicks. Marco, her oldest friend and sous chef, managed the prep team from a respectful distance. She wasn't in a sterile clinic or on an uncomfortable bar stool, and she was not alone. As the pressure subsided, she gazed out at the French Quarter, a city of spice and secrets her own great-grandmother had helped to flavor. She channeled that woman's quiet fire, the kind of power that never needed to be loud because it was baked into the very root of everything around them. David tapped gently on the door before entering the master's suite, which had been prepared for the birth. He was holding a tablet, its screen glowing with a single encrypted file, the type that, once executed, triggers a cascade of irreversible legal actions. He set it down beside her perfectly packed weekender bag. "The legal team is on standby for your authorization," David stated, his tone a comforting anchor. "At your convenience." Clara's eyes fell on the screen. It was the petition for legal separation, drafted to immediately freeze all joint assets and protect her controlling interest in their shared properties. It was a strategy born from betrayal, using the full weight of her family's resources to shield her child's future. The petition would specifically protect the assets tied to her family's publishing fortune, capital that Ethan's architectural firm had increasingly come to depend on. This wasn't an emotional outburst of revenge, but a move of absolute, ice-cold clarity, the kind that only comes after you've been betrayed by the person you trusted most. She signed it, her full name, Clara Elizabeth Warren, with the unshakable hand of a woman who wasn't merely ending a marriage, but was fortifying an empire for her heir. When you finally break free from a person who was dimming your own light, my friends, or a career that felt more like a prison of comfort, the hardest part isn't leaving. It's steeling yourself against the inevitable moment the one who shattered your life insists they cannot live without you. Protect your serenity. It is the most valuable asset you will ever own. For a brief period, the suite was a haven of tranquility. Everything was under control. Clara was secure, her son was imminent, and the sting of discovering those photos on the family cloud drive was already beginning to recede. But just 30 minutes into that calm, David's phone vibrated with a notification that shattered the fragile peace. Ethan Warren had not been wringing his hands in a hospital waiting room. He had been on a frantic call, not with relatives, but with Marcus Vance, his slick business partner and the public relations guru for their architectural firm. Marcus, a man who smelled opportunity and disaster, saw the impending separation as an existential threat to their client list. He had immediately retained a notoriously aggressive PR agency known for its take-no-prisoners approach. Less than 1 hour after Clara had gone into labor, a well-known Boston society blogger posted a story fed line by line from Marcus's team. The blog post was a toxic work of art, painting Clara as a hormonal, unstable heiress and claiming her increasing paranoia and unreasonable jealousy were the reasons for the split. It was a preemptive assault intended to destroy her reputation and position Ethan as the sympathetic, wronged husband. The narrative was bolstered by an unattributed quote from a source close to the family, alleging Clara was threatening to leverage her family's media influence to ruin Ethan's career, making her an unfit mother. David relayed the sickening details to Clara between her contractions. She was mid-breath, mid-effort, in the very heart of the most profound experience of her life, when she was told a PR team was attempting to brand her as mentally incompetent to the entire world. The calm was shattered. The feeling of safety evaporated. A narcissist never admits defeat, my friends. They just change the battlefield. The second you build a wall, you can expect them to arrive with a cannon. So, be prepared. Have your own fortifications ready. Keep every receipt. But David hadn't protected the Warren family's interests and reputation for 30 years by being easily surprised. He had spent decades planning for every contingency, building defensive measures that remained invisible until activated. Within the hour, David had utterly dismantled the attack. He placed a single call to the chairman of the media conglomerate that owned the blog, a man who served on 2 of the Warren family's literacy foundation boards. He then forwarded the chairman a secure file containing not just the intimate photos of Ethan and the designer, but financial records showing Ethan had been billing the firm for her services on ghost projects, effectively embezzling funds to finance their affair. The evidence was an undeniable portrait of calculated financial fraud, not a simple case of infidelity. It included damning emails and falsified invoices that documented a deep and methodical betrayal. The blogger was fired and the post was scrubbed from the internet, replaced with a full retraction and apology in under 60 minutes. David's assistant, a brilliant young woman named Sarah who was managing the situation from their downtown office, arrived at the townhome breathless and with a few strands of hair escaping her bun. She looked less like a calm executive assistant and more like someone who had just sprinted through the public garden. She held up her tablet to show David the confirmed retraction, exhaled slowly, and asked, "Is it always this chaotic?" David, without looking away from his own device, replied, "This is a preliminary skirmish. Clara Warren's son was born at 11:52 p.m. He came into the world in a suite at the top of a historic building with a view of the Charles River, delivered by the most sought-after obstetrician in New England, surrounded by the kind of fierce, unwavering loyalty that gives everything and expects nothing. He was born without a crowd, without the hollow presence of a man who had forfeited his right to be there. When the midwife placed the baby on Clara's chest, the infant radiating the impossible heat of new life, she studied her son's face and felt a sensation she hadn't even known was gone: completeness. Not the borrowed completeness that comes from molding yourself to fit into someone else's world, but the profound, solid completeness of a person who has finally reclaimed her own center of the universe. She held her son, feeling the tangible weight of him, the perfect, unbelievable weight of this new person in this quiet room, and she made a silent vow. It didn't need to be said aloud because it was already an immutable truth. You will never be an afterthought, not for a single moment of your existence, not as long as I am breathing. David came back into the suite just past midnight, carrying a mug of the herbal tea she liked from the kitchen downstairs. He also quietly confirmed that the asset freeze had been executed precisely as Clara had ordered. Clara was nursing her newborn son when he entered. She looked over at him. David put the tea on the bedside table with the effortless care of a person who has dedicated his life to anticipating needs before they are voiced. "He's in the private waiting area on the ground floor," David said gently. "He's been refusing to leave for nearly 2 hours. Clara looked down at her son, at his tiny, curled fingers. "David," she asked, "what did my grandfather always say?" When a business partner came to him with a heartfelt apology after they'd tried to cheat him. David paused. He'd been a young man in the room for so many of those meetings in the old publisher's office, watching a master of quiet strength operate. The lesson was ingrained in him. He never wasted his breath arguing, Clara, he recalled. He told you to ignore their words and watch their hands. He believed a person's actions are their only real confession. Then he would have them shown out and would sever all ties. Clara gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Tell him he can come up. Just make sure he comes alone. Not his design partner, not an assistant, just him." When Liam stepped through the front door of their Pacific Heights townhouse at 9 o'clock that night, the first thing he felt was the silence. The usual soft jazz was gone, the warm lighting replaced by a stark, cold glow from the kitchen. The scent of fresh paint and new plaster, their endless renovation, suddenly felt sterile, like a museum. Olivia was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, her hand resting on her 8-month pregnant belly. The entire bay glittered behind her, a sprawling, indifferent kingdom of lights. She didn't turn around immediately. She was staring at the scale model of his waterfront project, the one destined to make his career. With a chillingly precise movement, she picked up a tiny, perfect model of a cypress tree and deliberately snapped it in half. Only then did she finally turn to face him. Liam had walked into every room in his life confident he was in charge, but standing there he knew with a certainty that froze his blood that he was a trespasser in his own home. He had always been the architect of his own story, shaping narratives with a designer's precision, but standing in the entryway of their home, seeing Olivia by the window with that broken model piece in her hand, the blueprint was gone. No excuse could be drafted. No revision could fix this. He tried to form a word, but his throat felt like concrete. He managed one. "Liv." "Her name is Zara, isn't it?" Olivia said, her voice unnervingly calm as she gazed out at the distant lights of Sausalito. "I was testing the new smart home hub. The security cameras are always on." A flicker of something in his composed expression didn't just crack, it disintegrated. It wasn't the panic of a man caught in an affair. It was the silent, sickening collapse of an architect who finally sees a fatal structural flaw in his own design and knows the whole thing is about to come down. "I never wanted you to find out like that," he whispered. "I know," Olivia replied. "That was never part of the plan." She turned from the window, her eyes clear of the tears that had come and gone hours earlier. The hurt had burned away, leaving an icy, sharp focus she hadn't felt in years. "The plan," she stated, "was that there shouldn't have been a conversation to overhear at all. Who I am, the mother of your daughter, shouldn't have been a problem you needed a new life design to manage." "I earned your loyalty, Liam. You owed me that because I am your wife, because I am carrying our child, because I was in the most vulnerable moment of my life, and you were supposed to be the one foundation I could count on." He had no design to counter that. No schematic could fix it. It was the raw, unchangeable truth. "You can be her father," Olivia said, her voice now a whisper. "Our daughter deserves to have a father. But Liam, she also deserves to see what a woman who knows her own worth does next. And honestly, so do I." Liam's gaze fell to her swollen stomach. He looked at the curve of her belly, hiding their daughter, and for a fleeting second, the sterile quiet of the unfinished house felt like a tomb. "Good night, Liam," Olivia said. And Liam Sterling walked out the door, took the stairs down to the street, and stood in the damp San Francisco fog, believing he had finally grasped the full scope of the life he had just demolished. He was wrong. He didn't know the tenth of it. At 9:45 that night, Zara Hayes was sliding an iPad across the polished concrete bar of a Soma lounge, 6 miles from Pacific Heights, making a deal that would obliterate the evening's tense quiet and ignite a professional firestorm far more calculated and vicious than anything that had happened in that townhouse. The deal was with a man named Evan Reed, a prominent architecture blogger who operated in the gray area between industry critique and career assassination. He was the kind of influencer who knew that in the war for contracts and commissions, the first rumor to circulate becomes the blueprint, regardless of the facts. Evan, Zara said, I have a story for you, and the exclusive access I'm offering is substantially more valuable than your usual sources. By 10 the next morning, the blog post was drafted. By noon, it was sent to every major developer in the city. By 3, it was the lead topic in every design forum. The headline was engineered for maximum professional damage: art heiress Olivia Caldwell's pregnancy. Stress derails landmark project. Insiders fear total collapse. The article was a calculated masterpiece of corporate cruelty. Olivia was cast not as the betrayed wife, not as an expectant mother discovering her husband's deceit, but as an unstable, meddling heiress who manufactured a crisis to sabotage a brilliant young architect, her own husband. Zara was presented as the blameless victim, a talented junior designer suffering from burnout who was verbally harassed and threatened by a paranoid wife in a jealous fit. The post cited anonymous sources from within the firm. They detailed Zara's exhaustion as a serious issue that Olivia had cruelly dismissed. It framed Olivia's calls to the project manager as an attempt to professionally intimidate her husband's team. It never breathed a word about the affair, never mentioned the deception, not a single beam of the truth. By 4 o'clock, Olivia's name, her photo from an old gallery opening, her father's business legacy, the arts foundation she had poured her life into, it was all industry gossip. The private life Olivia had so carefully maintained, the clear line between her curatorial work and her family's business, was demolished by a single viral post. Her brother, Alex, woke Olivia at 4:30 with a phone call. She was at her family's vineyard in Napa, their daughter kicking gently inside her, the valley hills painted gold by the afternoon sun. She listened as Alex read the headline to her. She heard the first few sentences, and for the first time since it all began, a new kind of pain took hold. Not the physical strain of late pregnancy, not the sharp wound of betrayal, but the cold horror of professional ruin. The absolute violation of having your reality stolen, redrafted by an enemy, and weaponized to paint you as the villain in your own life story. In our world, your entire reputation can be torn down and redesigned by someone else in under 8 hours. The only counteroffer is the truth, documented, verified, and ready to launch. If you ever feel you're in a position where the narrative could be twisted against you, start documenting everything, immediately, now. Olivia hung up the phone. She looked at the vineyard. She rested a hand on her stomach. Then she called Alex back. "What is our response?" she asked. Alex was already in his car. "Everything," he said. The complete, unedited recordings from the townhouse security system, detailing every word of their plan, all time-stamped. The firm's server logs showing Zara downloaded Liam's final project files to a personal drive 2 weeks ago. The encrypted texts, the private car receipts, the hotel folio from his solo business trip to Chicago last month. And, he continued, his voice tight with anger, the hidden audio files from Zara's cloud account that I just decrypted. It's a conversation between her and Maxwell Thorne, confirming she was supposed to leak the altered project files to a rival developer an hour ago to frame you for sabotage. He was in on it. Olivia stared at that final piece of the trap for a very long time. He was in on it, Olivia whispered. Alex nodded. He knew she was having an affair with Liam. He knew it was happening. He helped her craft the narrative for the blog. The betrayal wasn't just a moment of weakness, it was a hostile takeover. Olivia closed her eyes for 3 heartbeats. When she opened them, they were clear and hard. "What else?" she demanded. Alex hesitated. "There's more," he said, "but maybe you should try to process this first." "I don't want to process," Olivia said. "I want the schematics." What Alex laid out for Olivia over the next 40 minutes in the sunroom of her family's Napa estate, while their daughter slept and the city seethed with slanderous rumors, was not one single reality. It was an intelligence briefing, peeling back layer after layer of a meticulously constructed deception. Each revelation went deeper, exposing a hidden framework of a conspiracy that Olivia had sensed for months, but could never quite prove was there. Alex began with Maxwell Thorne. When the Family Foundation's security software flagged the first anonymous smear against her father's company 6 months ago, Alex had commissioned a full forensic audit of all communications involving Thorne's development company for the past 2 years. It was a quiet countermeasure he had put in place. What the audit uncovered was not a recent affair. It was a long-running corporate sabotage campaign. Maxwell Thorne had been in secret communication with a woman at Liam's firm for over 18 months. That woman was Zara Hayes. Zara Hayes was the daughter of a contractor whose company had been ruined 15 years ago when Olivia's father, Daniel Caldwell, had publicly exposed him for using faulty materials in a city project. It was a scandal her father had uncovered so decisively, so publicly, that Zara's family had left the state in disgrace, leaving her with a resentment that had cooled into a patient, cold, and deeply personal obsession. Thorne and Zara's encrypted messages laid out a strategy that was anything but impulsive. Thorne had been coaching Zara on how to engineer a high-profile divorce for Liam, one that would paint Olivia as mentally unstable and give Thorne leverage to force Daniel Caldwell to sell the one piece of waterfront property his family foundation refused to part with. Amelia had been unknowingly feeding Liam a steady stream of intimate details about her creative process, her stress, her fears about the pregnancy, creating a portfolio that could be used to prove she was creatively unstable, just as the whispers online were now suggesting. The affair with Sophie wasn't a mistake, Marco said. It was a strategy. Amelia just stared at him. "Strategy?" she repeated. Marco angled his phone toward her. "Sophie Renault," he said. Her birth name was Sophie Martin, Old Man Martin's granddaughter. The kitchen was perfectly silent. Sophie was placed inside your circle. It began 8 months ago at a food festival in a humid, oak-shaded New Orleans park, a carefully arranged meeting. The entire relationship had been a performance, meticulously prepared with a single goal: to detonate her career, to orchestrate a public failure that would give the Martin family their revenge, and to cast Liam as the heartbroken husband when the truth about her stolen family recipes finally came to light. Amelia stood frozen in her office. She looked at the sepia-toned photograph of her great-grandmother on the wall, the woman who had been a legendary Creole chef for decades. The very chef who had thoroughly outshined Sophie's grandfather at the World's Fair 60 years ago. The woman who told her that a palate was the only asset that could never be stolen. Liam wasn't the business mind, Amelia thought, her words feeling hollow in the echoing new dining room. He was just the money. Her mentor, Antoine, simply pursed his lips. He was the money. Always trust your gut, my dear chefs. If a critic's rise feels too fast, if every tragic backstory, every sold-out pop-up, every glowing review seems to lead to the same convenient conclusion, you are not being suspicious. You are seeing the recipe, and every recipe has an author. But this restaurant had one more service to go. Because Liam Garrett, feeling confident from the very rumor mill he was bankrolling, now had the perfect cover for his main course. He moved with stunning speed. At 10:30 that morning, less than 3 hours after Amelia's frantic call to her lawyer, Liam's attorneys filed a formal motion to restructure their partnership. The legal argument was inventive, vicious, and designed for maximum humiliation. Their restaurant, they argued, was built on his financial acumen. Amelia's father, they claimed, had pressured her into demanding creative control. When Liam was just a novice investor and professionally vulnerable, the entire operating agreement, their motion claimed, was therefore invalid. And as part of that motion, Garrett's lawyers submitted a petition for an emergency injunction to control their unborn child's trust, this time with a more poisonous flavor. The logic was clean and brutal. If the agreement was invalid, Amelia's recipes, including the seed money for her new restaurant, became shared assets, and her fraudulent concealment of these joint recipes, paired with her well-known hormonal volatility, was grounds to declare her creatively incompetent. Amelia was about to lose everything: her reputation, her child's future, and her independence, all because she had built a life with a man who was never really her partner. And because Liam's family had, in their desperate scramble for status, aligned themselves with her own family's oldest culinary rivals, this was the moment Amelia's carefully plated world shattered. She sat in a worn leather armchair in her French Quarter apartment, her unborn baby, a tiny boy she'd decided to name Gabriel, kicking softly. The lights of the city glittered like spilled champagne below. For the first time in months, her composed exterior finally broke. She felt completely lost. She reached for a well-worn, sauce-stained cookbook her old mentor had published, remembering the note scrawled inside. "You create dishes so powerful that other people's imitations become the proof of their own fraud," he ever wrote. Amelia closed the cookbook. She looked at Antoine. "I need Luke," she said, "and I need the reservation history of every dish Sophie has praised or critiqued in the last 12 months. For the first time all night, Antoine offered a sharp, hungry smile. "Already being plated," he replied. Amelia Hayes didn't want revenge. She curated consequences. And what she built over the next 3 days from her apartment, with her baby bump as her desk and a research assistant who ran on chicory coffee and fierce devotion, was not an argument. It was a tasting menu, every ingredient cross-referenced, every supplier invoice traced, every flavor profile dissected. Each course was chosen not to destroy her enemies, but to make the truth so visceral, so undeniable, and so deliciously obvious that their social collapse was simply the natural digestif to the story she was serving. Part 1. The amuse-bouche. Amelia released a single encrypted menu to a curated list of food critics and the top investors in New Orleans. No insults, no accusations, just the documented creative process. The scanned pages from Sophie's notebooks, dated and verified. The notes were written on cocktail napkins stolen from Amelia's private tastings, the embossed restaurant logo faintly visible. The private reservation records showing Liam's trip with Sophie to a food symposium 2 days before their wedding anniversary. The expense reports, the phone records showing Liam's location when he claimed to be sourcing ingredients. The digital visitor logs from Sophie's test kitchen showing her carefully scheduled tastings that aligned perfectly with Amelia's prenatal appointments. She let the evidence tell the story, and it simmered with such clarity that every food blogger who had praised Sophie's raw, intuitive palate spent the next morning frantically deleting their articles. Luc Martin, the blogger who had written the most fawning preview, received a formal recipe correction from Amelia's legal counsel. It wasn't an accusation, just a clarification with footnotes so precise that his publication pulled the story before dessert was served. Part 2. The Heritage Clause. Antoine filed a motion with the board of the city's most prestigious culinary society, and the documents he presented contained a single piece of evidence that stopped Liam's power play cold. 30 years ago, when Liam Garrett's father had tried to force Amelia's grandfather off that very board, his own lawyers had performed a full audit of the society's original 1888 charter. That same audit, buried deep in the city archives, had concluded in writing that the charter's culinary authenticity clause was unbreakable and legally absolute, and that Amelia's grandfather was the sole guardian of its standards. The Garrett family's current claim that the clause was an outdated technicality was a direct contradiction of their own legal team's historical findings. His own father's lawyers had already validated the very rule Liam was now trying to circumvent. The society's board required very little time to discuss the matter. The motion was denied. Liam Garrett's name was forwarded to the Authenticity and Ethics Committee for review. Part 3. The Dissolution. Amelia filed on the morning of the third day. The filing was cool, factual, and devastating. It included Liam's private text with his father, proving he had conspired with his wife's, a greatest culinary adversary to sabotage her family's legacy. It included the evidence of the affair with Sophie. It included the reservation logs. And it included one more genealogical detail that Antoine had been saving for this very moment. Sophie was not just Liam's lover. She was the estranged granddaughter of the very first chef Amelia's grandmother had ever taken under her wing. The entire affair had been an act of generational jealousy. The chef's bitter granddaughter had been sent to seduce Liam as part of a long-game plan to dismantle Amelia's career from the inside. When this truth became public, the fallout was immediate. Not because of the affair, not because of the money, but because the narrative had shifted into something far more compelling than a messy divorce. It became the story of a brilliant chef, consistently underestimated by the men in her life, who endured their condescension with quiet expertise for years, and who, when the moment came, proved that the person they had ignored was the most powerful force in the kitchen. Luke, who had been hunting down reservation records and supplier invoices for 72 hours straight, and looked like he'd aged 5 years and 3 days, fell into a chair in Antoine's office after the last document was verified and said, "I need to unplug from the world for a month." Antoine, reviewing the final petition, said without looking up, "Consider it a culinary tour, Luke." He stared at the ceiling. "I need a complete food world blackout." The consequences landed with the slow, satisfying weight of a perfectly braised dish. Sophie was unmasked. Her bitter family history became the main topic of conversation in the same dining rooms. That had once lauded him as a genius, the ultimate tastemaker in the cutthroat New York publishing world. His imprint, which ran on exclusive manuscripts, breathless industry gossip, and the power of anointing the next literary star, collapsed in under a month. Leo Vance had investors who could stomach a failed book launch. They could not stomach the scandal of him using company advances to finance his affair with his lead author. His own partners on the board gave him 2 weeks to clear out his desk. His obsession with his prodigy had incinerated his entire career. The literary foundations that had showered awards on Ela Rowe, mostly at her mother-in-law's urging, quietly removed her from their long lists. They knew a reputational crisis when they saw one. And Leo's mother, Beatrice Vance, who had spent 4 years orchestrating Sophie's exclusion from their circle, who had belittled her daughter-in-law's commercial tastes, who believed she was curating a magnificent future for the family's literary dynasty, that her own children were appalled when the full extent of the manipulation was revealed, was voted off the board of every philanthropic trust by Leo's own siblings. They issued a press release that was a mere 2 sentences, but left no room for doubt. Beatrice Vance had not been invited to meet her grandson. She would not be part of his life, and the antique bookshelves in their Hamptons estate, The ones she had posed in front of for decades with Sophie always relegated to the background, were sold at auction. 6 months later, Sophie Hayes stood in a book-lined office. Not a sterile corporate tower, not a minimalist cubicle with fluorescent lights and gray carpet. This place was different. It felt lived in. The light was golden and soft. The floors were worn, original hardwood, and the armchairs, the ones tucked into reading nooks, were vintage leather, worn in, and placed with deliberate comfort in mind. Because the friend who helped her find the space understood, on a soul-deep level, what it was like to be trapped in a world that stifles your instincts while you are trying to nurture the most precious thing imaginable. The launch of Hearthstone Press was meant to be Sophie's quiet declaration of independence. She'd funded it with the buyout from her agency, a check that arrived the same day she learned she was pregnant. It wasn't the biggest move of her career, but it was profoundly her own. The press was a haven, a home for the kinds of voices Leo had deemed unworthy. For the debut novelists told their stories were too quiet, for the genre writers dismissed by the literary elite, for the storytellers who deserved, after years of rejection, a place to be heard, to have someone tell them, everything you need to change the world is right here on these pages. Sophie stood in the cozy reception area with her son, Oliver, in her arms, just 3 months old, with his mother's observant eyes and his father's charm and the perfect grounding weight of a newborn, who couldn't yet comprehend the world of stories he was born into, but who would one day know that the small press that surrounded him was built from courage. Professor Albright stood beside Sophie as he had for a decade, with the patient, calm presence of a mentor who knew his job wasn't to dictate her choices, but to champion her vision. To be the one who answers a 3 a.m. phone call with, "I've already read the manuscript." Leo was across the city, desperately trying to get a photo op with a loyal author at a book signing, and somehow the paparazzi flashbulbs reflected off Isla's designer heels as she swept through the crowd at her launch party. Her publisher, helmed by Leo, had made her the biggest name in fiction, and the whispers in Manhattan were relentless. She had turned Leo from a respected executive into a scandal in under a year. His pregnant wife, Sophie, thought it was his legendary eye for talent. Leo said it was his gift for whining and dining critics until dawn. They were both missing the most important part of the story. A senior editor from Sophie's old agency was there as a courtesy. He was browsing a shelf of first editions near the bar, but when he saw Sophie look overwhelmed, he crossed the room and gave her an encouraging nod. On Sophie's arm, that same loyal, reassuring presence. Some colleagues, thankfully, become allies. Her closest friend, Maria, a bulldog of a lawyer from a top Manhattan firm, was in her apartment before the first industry newsletter published the news of Leo and Isla's affair. Maria handled the chaos, deflecting Leo's frantic, pleading calls with a calm tone that promised absolute legal annihilation. She walled Sophie off from the entire sordid affair, building an ironclad case around her and her son. Sophie got the brownstone in the village. She hadn't seen Leo in 150 days. The divorce was finalized with a quiet efficiency that enraged the gossip columnists hungry for a public battle. Leo contested nothing. He agreed to every term, transferred the funds, and after it was all signed, he had a courier deliver a single cloth-bound book. It was a signed first edition of her favorite novel. A note was tucked inside. "Forgive me, not for the betrayal, but for the unforgivable failure of my own story." Sophie looked at the book. She didn't respond, not because the gesture was meaningless, but because it was 7 months too late. And the woman who once believed in his grand literary gestures had vanished that day she read the manuscript. Leo was granted supervised visits with their son, Oliver. He appeared every other Saturday, a ghost of his former self, awkwardly trying to be the father he never was as a husband. Sophie never objected. She knew Oliver deserved to know the man who gave him his laugh, but she also knew Oliver deserved to witness a woman build an entire world from the ashes, and she was determined to give her son a front row seat for the rest of his life. And this, everyone, is the most crucial lesson from her story. The most profound success isn't about revenge, it's about creation. It's about curating a legacy so authentic and so powerful that the person who called your passion a cute little side project has to watch your authors dominate the bestseller lists they once controlled. That is the kind of victory they can never touch, not because it's built to spite them, but because it is built to endure. And that strength, the kind that comes from trusting your own taste and refusing to let anyone else dictate your story, is the one masterpiece no one can ever copy. Sophie gazed out over the city, at the stacks of manuscripts waiting to be read, at the cover designs for the novels that would make Hearthstone Press a force to be reckoned with. She looked up at the elegant gold lettering on her office door. Hearthstone Press. It was the name for a dream she had nearly let die. She held her son a little closer, breathing in the scent of old paper and new beginnings, and walked toward the heart of the press she had founded, into the legacy she was building. Into the future she had once scribbled on a napkin in a noisy coffee shop. She gave no thought to her past, because no draft left behind could ever hold a candle to the world she was now publishing. People, you have just heard the story of a woman who was undermined, betrayed, and cast aside at her most vulnerable, who answered not with bitterness, but with brilliance, instinct, and the quiet resolve of someone who decided to write her own ending. The lesson is as simple as it is powerful. Never mistake someone's nurturing spirit for a lack of ambition. Never assume their quiet nature means they lack strength. And never, ever use someone's devotion as the plot device for your own grand narrative. Because you have no idea who they truly are, you are blind to the worlds they are building inside themselves, and by the time you see what they've created, it might be the most acclaimed story in the entire country, and you won't even rate a mention in the acknowledgments. Post a comment with the most important lesson you took from Sophie's journey. What kind of world would you have built? And be sure to subscribe for more tales of resilience and creation. Until next time, find your own story, champion your own voice, and never let anyone make you feel like a minor character in your own life. This story was intentionally conceived, written, and produced by our team to share meaningful ideas with important takeaways. Each character journey was purposefully shaped, and every plot development is designed to inspire a moment of self-reflection. Thank you for being a cherished part of our community.